Welcome to Frequencies, a satellite podcast brought to you by ST Engineering iDirect, where we take a closer look at shaping how the world connects. Recently, ST Engineering iDirect presented a webinar entitled The Devil and the Deep Blue Sea. The webinar, which touched on a variety of important themes in the maritime industry today, was moderated by KD Adamson, the Futurist-in-Resident at Futurenautics. KD Adamson is a catalyst and visionary for those building the future of shipping, maritime and the blue economy. Now we are catching up with KD again to discuss some of these ideas further, and with connectivity at top of mind. Please enjoy our 4-part interview series hosted by Andrew Faiola, Head of Mobility at ST Engineering iDirect. In today's episode, Andrew and KD discuss the need for sustainability in shipping, the physical internet, better data practices for maritime, and much more. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Well, welcome back, Kate, once again for our next installment.
It's a great pleasure to be back. Looking forward to the next round.
Very good. Well, one of the things that you discussed during the webinar again was the global logistics ecosystem and the global supply chain. And I'm reminded of a couple of large, broad statistics that if shipping were a country, it would rank 6th largest greenhouse gas emitter. And yet they also say that 90% of everything travels by ship. So if shipping is so clearly enmeshed in the global supply chain, but we see this large emitter, what can shipping do for its part to help others and help clean up the overall global supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think, once again, it's so easy to look at shipping and say, oh, you're a big emitter. But the point is that shipping is part of, highly complex value webs and value chains and supply chains. So I think I mentioned when we were talking in the first episode about the fact that, we say, oh, we can save you money on fuel, but it's not always the ship operator that pays the fuel. There are all sorts of, really misaligned incentives around shipping, that have grown up for various reasons over the years. But when we talk about emerging, digital, decarbonized and circular, those are really the watchwords of what we're going to need to be in the future. So if you're going to achieve those things, you cannot on an individual level move the needle. These are, really big collaborative, global collaborative systems level change. And that means that shipping has to involve a huge range of stakeholders in helping it to actually move to this decarbonization point. Because, at the moment, ship operators are in a position where they're saying, well, what kind of engine should I invest in? What kind of new ship should I invest in? And frankly, these are very, very difficult decisions. Then I think it's a bit much to expect ship operators, ship owners, to actually make these decisions because they don't have control of them. But as an ecosystem, they do. So, here's another stat for you. Something like 70 or 80% of all the marine fuel around the world is bought in about 7 or 10 ports. So, all this we've had over the years about, well, there isn't the infrastructure to do this or that and the other, actually a concerted effort that brought together stakeholders and ecosystem that said, this is the fuel we're going for. We are going to create the fueling infrastructure. We are going to come together as consortiums to actually build these ships. And we are going to make sure that they, that they trade during their lifespan and they are able to be traded during their lifespan. That is a very different model than what we have now, which is, is a ship owner going to gamble on the fact that they can make enough money or that the ship is just going to be, unsaleable, all these things. So I think, again, it's an ecosystem play. It has to change. But as far as the broader logistics industry is concerned, I mentioned the physical internet in the keynote that I did at the webinar. And the physical internet is something very important because what the physical internet says is, look, you've got all these multiple different modes of transport, and you've got all these different operators, and they're all trying to effectively do the same thing. So why don't you try and create, in the same way that the internet, sends things in packages and packets and reassembles it here. So, technology, communications, connectivity guys, should get this straight away. So the idea is, rather than having all these different people trying to duplicate the same thing, you actually create a system where you've got hubs and the other bits and pieces, and you move these goods around them. Now, they've done some research about this in the US. They reckon it could save about $100 billion a year in logistics costs by implementing something like this. And of course, shipping would need to be part of that. But of course, if you're going to do that, then you've got to be absolutely, plumbed in terms of connectivity, transparency, visibility. And I think, again, this is where, connectivity technology companies need to start looking at it, because a lot of ship operators, they go, well, this all sounds really good, but I mean, I can't put the infrastructure together to do this. And I think in terms of orchestrating that, these are the kind of big moves, systemic changes that are actually going to change things like shipping's emissions. But it takes an ecosystem of stakeholders to come together to actually make it happen.
Well, you talk about, let's say, the connectivity being plumbed in. And, I think we're at a point where connectivity is pretty much as basic as electricity. Just that you don't have the cords to reach the ships once they leave port, right? So I think, what we're seeing on our side is really now starting to be, greater implementation of IoT services, the ability to collect information from sensors on board vessels, and with the advent of 5G and the standards around 5G, we're starting to see a discretionary view in terms of, how do I impact what happens on the ship? How do I bring certain information to shore? What stays where? What needs to be real time, as we discussed last time, versus what needs to happen as and when it happens? And I think, you mentioned in the webinar, and you touched on it briefly, you talk about radical transparency. And I think if you're part of, let's say, the SATCOM value chain, how do you, let's say, help provide this radical transparency? I mean, I think about, in particular, again, things like being able to play in a standardized environment, because again, I look at it from, let's say, different parts of that ecosystem, and whether it's land-based logistics, or ship-based, or even aircraft-based. I'd like to think that ultimately, for a lot of this intelligence, you need to have standardization across the board, so people can actually, that might not be an immediate stakeholder, but part of the overall ecosystem, have the ability to drive insights, have the ability to focus on particular bits of knowledge, whether it's around compliance or regulatory, or just plain finding a new way to make money. So from a service provider standpoint, in our little neck of the world, how do you see that playing out?
I think that there are a couple of really important points here. And one of them is that the shift to the third platform has told everybody that all they want is data. And actually, I mean, I could give you some horrendous figures for, the amount of money and everything else that, large organizations are spending on managing data. But the thing is, that data is only really useful to you in a particular use case. So what everybody's been encouraged to do is, data is valuable, get as much of it as you can. Actually, data costs you money. And the other thing about data is security, because the more data that you have, the more vulnerable you are, and the more vulnerable everybody else is who gives you their data, because you become a big fat target. And the shipping industry is, over the last 6 months, I think it's 400% increase in cyber attacks. So there are a couple of things that on a bigger than service provider level are relevant, but it's particularly relevant to service providers. So what we see going forward is that we now need to really identify what data is important, and we need to not allow data to become pooled in one area. So what we really want to be doing is thinking about, where does federation and blockchain come in here? How can we actually share the data we need without collecting extraneous data? And that comes down to actually knowing what you want to do, knowing what data you're accessing, why you're accessing it, and what you're going to use it for. And, I think a lot of people are surprised by the fact that so much data is collected, no one uses it. I mean, there's stuff sitting around. I think there are things like 60% of most data in most companies hasn't been touched for 6 months. And yet you're paying for storage costs, and that's a liability, you know, that from a cybersecurity perspective. So I think that's one thing that, yes, we need to actually exchange data. We don't necessarily need to gather it. And I think this is one of the real time things. Do you need that data in real time? Does it need to be stored? Does it need to be sent somewhere? I think this is where edge computing comes in, because of course, once you start moving processing power to the edge, you don't need to, haul it back to the cloud. You don't need to store it. You can do the minimum, analytics, whatever you need to do at the edge, and actually let things get on with it. So I think what connectivity and technology providers need to be looking at is, how do I orchestrate an ecosystem which is not based on me owning everyone's data? Because up until now, really all the marketplace have been the digital ecosystem model, which is, network effects, create great moats around your data, have an impenetrable ecosystem, and everybody else basically has to pay you to, to live their lives and do anything. And I don't think that that's going to be acceptable going forward, because I think what companies are saying is, no, we don't want to just be part of someone else's ecosystem. We need people who can orchestrate smart use of data. And I would just throw one other statistic in here. I get asked an awful lot about the data tsunami, we're all drowning in data. We're going to have more data in the next 5 years than we did in the last 5 years. And that's all true. But here's the interesting point. IDC do what they call a data sphere report. And actually the recursion rate of data, the rate at which data is analyzed and consumed, the same data is analyzed and consumed again, that's growing exponentially, but the actual rate of new data is only 20%. So actually this great data tsunami we're all talking about, it's not real. What it is it's coming from all this data that's being fed through artificial intelligence algorithms and machine learning. Let's use that data again and again. What we're not doing is getting fresh data. And that's a really interesting and important point, because if we relate that back to ship operators and the work that we did with Vodafone, what are we finding out here? We're finding that most of this data never comes off the ship. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So where's all this data coming from in marine? So I would say, there are some fundamental issues around the way that maritime and connectivity and technology providers have looked at data for the last few years, and the competitive advantage they think that data can give them. And I think we need to start revisiting those models and saying what you guys as technology and connectivity suppliers can start doing is looking at a blended approach, a blended connectivity approach, which doesn't seek to own the ecosystem, but seeks to orchestrate it and actually enable data, fresh data, to be used and analyzed for specific use cases, as opposed to just trying to own it.
I mean, that makes total sense to me. I think one of the cases that I've seen is, you've got a shipping operator who has, as much as you like to think from the outside, every ship looks the same, so it must be sort of the same. They will have, everyone is unique, in fact, and you might have 3 of the same type of vessel with 3 different power plants, and each of those power plants are creating or producing data on the running of that system that is incompatible with their compatriots' power plant, and the shipping operator needs to feel that they've got total ownership of the data itself, so that they don't want to share large data sets. So when you think about, how can you get the most benefit in decarbonization, for example, you'd like to be able to compare like for like, or analyze at least against relative means and things like that. And today it's still siloed and compartmentalized, and I think we're missing a trick. To your point, if we can get data in a format with security and ownership that is clear, and then is able to be accessed under the right conditions, I think you could, a rising tide lifts all boats, as they say, in terms of being able to really make a step change. I mean, do you see it the same way?
I do, and I think as well that once again, what we're doing is we're focusing on, how does shipping operate now? And I mean, on the webinar, it was really great to have Navis there. Of course, what Navis are doing is saying, look, there are all these little bits of kit, like, the loading computers, which people go, well, that's just a loading computer. What can that do? But actually, that and the fleet data, Inmarsat's fleet data product as well, which is, they develop with Danelec, or it's just a VDR, isn't it? But suddenly these pieces of kit become critical nodes in a different kind of ecosystem, because you can use the VDR basically to collect all sorts of stuff, and the loading computer information actually can be incredibly valuable to a range of stakeholders. So it's about looking at things in a different way, and that's why, again, I would encourage people to think about, at the moment, when a ship is built, connectivity, they don't even think about it. It's literally the last thing. You talk to new build departments, the connectivity is just way, 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 way down the list. It's kitchens and lavatories and bilge and all these other things, HVAC, that all comes way ahead of connectivity. And yet what we're saying is that this really is the bridge to all of this efficiency and everything else. So there needs to be, I think, the time has come, as we start saying, we need to look at how we build ships, how we design ships to be circular and recyclable from now, how we build them to be decarbonized. We should also be saying, how do we build them to be digital? And there's a huge opportunity for connectivity suppliers to be collaborating at a very early level, within that new value chain for shipping, because I personally believe that there is a very strong argument that says in the future it will not be individual owners that buy ships, but it could well be a shipyard who becomes the value chain owner, who builds the ship, who leases the ship, and then actually brings it back and recycles it at the end. So a relationship maybe with the shipyard is something that connectivity suppliers should be considering and evaluating, rather than an owner who may only own the ship for 3 or 4 years, or even for 6 months before it's even delivered. So I think, again, what you have to do is say, how are these global megatrends changing the way the whole industry is going to operate, not just what's going to be, how do we imagine what's happening today with a digital frame over it.
No, that's really useful information. I think we're at taking the very baby steps on that now, and you look at some initiatives like the one that Inmarsat has with Hyundai Heavy Industries, for example. And I think, to your point, we're starting to get there, but it really needs to be baked in from the get-go, from what I'm hearing. So this is really useful information for us. This is good food for thought, and I look forward to talking to you on the next one.
Yeah, me too.
If you enjoyed this conversation with Katie Adamson, be sure to check out the other episodes in this series. We cover a broad number of maritime topics that span technology, sustainability, and more. Thank you for listening to this Frequencies podcast. You can find other episodes on a range of topics wherever you listen to podcasts. Please join us again for more conversations with ST Engineering iDirect.